Cool. So my name's Daniel Burwin. I have a background in video games. It'll be part of the thing. But this is the keynote, sort of slightly modified, that I gave at the InfoDoc Labs documentary conference. It's not super long. I'm hoping we can do a lot of Q&A today because it's pretty informal. We've got time. I've got like an hour to talk to you guys, maybe some change after that. So I'm just going to sort of run you through this and sort of set up a context for my work today. And then show you some of that, and then hopefully you guys have lots and lots of questions. So, cool. All right. So the name of my talk is Welcome to the Age of the Interface. So if anyone here uses Twitter, feel free to say things on Twitter about me. So who I am. So my background's in graphic design and video games. I consider myself a storyteller. I worked at the intersection of art and technology. I used to work at Electronic Arts back in 2005 and Activision 2006. Left to teach for 4.5 years. Taught at a whole bunch of art colleges in the Bay Area. And during that time, I started up a studio called Cognito Comics, and we did an interactive graphic novel for the iPad called Project Ajax, which is how I met Judith. I had Google Alerts set up for whenever people mentioned my project, and I'm like, oh, who's this? And I'm like, hello, and she's like, hey. And so it just happened to be in the area for all this stuff, and so I thought I'd stop by. I'm currently a consultant working for Disney Imagineering at the moment, so I'm sort of on leave from them and working remotely while I travel. So basically, in terms of setting up the ideas today and what I want to discuss with you guys, this is a really great quote from John Lasseter, who's basically the catalyst, I think, that sort of made Pixar what it is today. And his quote is, technology inspires art, and art challenges the technology. And I think it's a really interesting thing to keep in your head today as I start talking about the different concepts of this relationship between technology and art. Especially in today's world where we are so technology-driven as a society. What that boils down to is I'm going to talk about two big formats for how we tell stories, film and games, and talk about how they're different and also how they're now intersecting. So this is the first film ever made according to the internet. This is The Horse in Motion, recorded in 1878, basically a big motion experiment. And it's essentially very similar to how film is today. It's photographic, it looks pretty good, it looks very accurate. And then what's so interesting is when you think about the first video game that came almost like 100 years later, right? To get, where's the noises? There it is. Right? So it took a long time just to get 3 dots to move around on a screen. And so essentially, I think when you think about the beginnings of these two formats, they start off in very different places, right? One is photographic and very realistic, and one is very, very lo-fi by comparison. Essentially what it boils down to is that film is a passive experience and games are an interactive one, right? If you think about the interface for watching a movie, if you go to a theater, there isn't one. You just walk in and you sit down and you wait for the movie to start. And then you watch and listen, and then the movie ends and you leave. And there's not really any participation at all. But games is participatory by nature. That you can't play Pong by watching. You have to actually get in there. And so there's an interface with games. And there's this whole other layer, not just with story and design and presentation, but there's interaction as well. This is funny. This is sort of. You guys remember Dragon's Lair? You remember this game? Right. It's 1983. This is the beginnings of, I think, trying to merge these two things together, which has the same fidelity as film and very limited interactions. Right. The screen would like flash yellow, and you'd have like an epileptic seizure trying to like hit the thing. It's like the most frustrating thing ever. But I thought this is a very fun sort of example of how those things start to merge in the 80s. In 1993, something really interesting happens where it isn't just a question of fidelity, but it's a question of how technology intersects both of these worlds. So I'm going to show you a clip. Everyone here should remember this. Oh, Google Ads, that's awesome. Away.
This species of your informative instincts is the Cretaceous period. I mean, this thing isn't.
I love it. He's like, look at the thing. Like, grabs her head. Spielberg totally set this up so well because you're like, what are they looking at? What could it be? They're so spellbound. For like almost a minute, they're spellbound, and then, oh, all right. How many people here remember this movie in theaters? Right? Yeah, it's a huge moment. And Spielberg was so intentional the way he set this up because they're like totally stunned. The way we're stunned seeing the dinosaur. And Sam Neill's next line, of course. Exactly. He's saying what we're thinking, right? And at that point, I mean, there's just nothing the film couldn't really do. But what's so fascinating about this is 1993. This is when 3D has really arrived as a tool, I think, legitimately in film. And after this, there's nothing we really couldn't do after that. But this is what's happening in games that same year. How many people here remember this game? Yeah? So I was in Canada at the time on a ski trip. And Canada is a test market for like all sorts of new products before they like release it on the American public. So if it's broken, the Canadians will like tell you. So this came out months before it was released in the States, and like none of my friends would believe me that I'd seen a real 3D like live video game. But this is Virtua Fighter 1, and it was really the first, I think, major sort of step forward for games to become fully realized in real-time 3D. And so 3D as a tool appears in both games and film, but with very different effects. So basically, these two industries that were typically separate and used different tools are now being unified by tools of 3D. If you want to think about what that means in terms of fidelity, visual fidelity, in terms of these two mediums, Horse in Motion versus Jurassic Park are actually very similar, if not identical, experiences in some ways. There's no participation required on either side of them, and of course the box of film evolves. We get 16:9, and we get color and HD, and we get 5-channel sound, but essentially it's the same experience. So if you want to think about, say, Pong to Virtua Fighter, right? I mean, it's like worlds of evolution, and then Jurassic Park's basically leveling us out in fidelity. After that, there isn't a lot further for film to go inside of the box, right? You can do new things with the technology, like Avatar, which is pretty cool. But essentially, it's always the same experience, and you just get little blips in that fidelity curve, which is essentially level at that moment in time. But games are just taken off in 1993, right? That's the beginnings of 3D, and games are just starting to sort of fully realize, oh wow, we can actually start to evoke the same experiences of film using camera, because it's now a 3D world the way film has been set up. And so different fidelity curves, different results, and different places they're going with the sort of orange dot of whatever that means in the future where they intersect. So this is basically the beginning of the console era, like the golden age of video games, as I see it. And in 1994, the Sony PlayStation comes out. And games are basically 3D from then on. There's really no going back in a lot of ways for the next sort of chunk of time. And if you want to think about this sort of fidelity curve of these consoles, I use texture memory as a measurement of this. But basically, Virtua Fighter had 1 megabyte of texture memory, which is the memory used to store the images that wrap around 3D models. So the more texture memory you have, higher resolution it can be, better looking the visual fidelity of the games. So the PlayStation 1 in 1994 had 2 megabytes, and the PlayStation 2 in 2000 had 4. So we got twice as much. And then in 2006, we got 256 with the PlayStation 3. So it really is this like crazy upward swing in terms of what these machines can do from a fidelity standpoint. And I have it leveling out here because it's 2012, and we're due, for a new console. We haven't seen it yet. So what this means is the console lifespan is approximately 6 years, and the emphasis has been on visual fidelity, making the games look really, really, really good. And fidelity looks pretty good now. I mean, this is Virtua Fighter now, and it's a huge step forward from that first game we saw. We started to get like blue lighting and depth of field and normal maps and real-time lighting effects and all sorts of cool stuff that film has basically had in the Jurassic Park era. We're now doing in real time. I'll just show you a little clip of the latest video card called Kepler from NVIDIA. This is actually shipping in the latest iMac. So this is basically real-time ray tracing. The graphics card is shipping today. It's essentially doing pre-rendered film quality visuals. And so it's pretty cool to see what you can do now with an over-the-counter consumer-level graphics card. So all that procedural destruction, real-time reflection mapping, and all that sort of stuff. And you can even see here, he'll pick up pieces of the glass and start breaking it, right? And it procedurally destructs. So it isn't just how it looks, it's how it acts and reacts with physics and stuff like that. So what's so fascinating to me about this is that while visual fidelity has been up on this huge upward swing in games, the interface has hardly changed. This is the PlayStation 1 controller on the left, and the PlayStation 3 controller on the right, and there's not that big a difference between them. I mean, these had evolved from like the Nintendo D-pad and the joystick of the Atari over time with the D-pad and shoulder buttons and all that sort of stuff. But if you think about it now, I mean, it's really relatively the same interface. We get wireless connectivity and the dual analog sticks, but I think those were actually introduced in the PlayStation 1 days as well, the DualShock controller. So essentially, they're pretty much identical. And so, I think it's a fascinating thing to think about is that here you have this this controller that